So we will go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining. I hope everyone had a safe, healthy, and restful holiday break. We're going to jump right back into the swing of things here with a little bit of a different agenda this time. I know the past two or three meetings we've had the JU kind of start walking through some of those spreadsheets that go through point by point on the assumptions development for scenario 2 and 3, that we've put off the headroom presentation for a while now. So we're going to jump right into having the utilities give a presentation on their headroom calculations, because that could help inform the finalization of the scenario 2 and 3 assumptions. And it's just a good information for the EPAC members to have. So we'd rather kind of get some of that out there sooner than later. So that's the main thing we have on the agenda today, is to go through that presentation from the utilities about their headroom, the methodology, how it impacts the capacity expansion model. And then if we have some time, we might be able to have some questions and discussion about the scenario development. But for the most part, the finalization of those last two scenarios will probably wait until the next EPAC meeting in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from today. Hopefully that's on folks' calendars. So that's the plan for today and for next meeting. I will note that I think those two meetings, this one and then 2 weeks from today, I believe are the final two meetings from our originally scheduled sequence. So I will be sending an email out after this meeting this week to get folks input on when to continue, whether to continue this time frame, Mondays from 2 to 4 p.m. for maybe through February and March, as we start getting preliminary results on some capacity expansion modeling, and doing a few more presentations from the utilities on things like the detailed siting methodology that's going to be used in stage 2 and 3. So I'll send an email about that later this week, trying to kind of come to ground on when to continue this sequence of EPAC meetings. So you can expect that from me. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the presenters from the JU to walk through the headroom presentation. And as always, feel free to come off mute and ask questions, or pop something in the chat. If you have a question, I'll be monitoring that and be posing those questions to the JU. So I'll hand it over to the utility folks to pull up that presentation and go ahead with it. And while they're doing that, were there any other questions from EPAC members before we get started? Okay, sounds good. Take it away.
Yep. How did you want to present it, or you want me to pull it up?
Yeah, yeah. If I can present it if you want.
Sounds good.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hao Fu from PSEG Long Island Transmission Planning. I'm here on behalf of the joint utilities to present about the headroom calculation that each utilities perform in support of CGPP Stage 1. Just close this one. Yes, so each utilities calculate a capacity and energy headroom for their respective areas based on the methodology that was established in the straw proposal for conducting headroom assessments and associate addendum. So all the utilities use a unified set of planning power flow models, specifically the 2023 NYISO FERC 715 filing cases and the information provided within the 2023 NYISO Go Book. Any exceptions to those assumptions are noted in the headroom filing. So let's talk about the calculation itself. So at the first steps, we take out our kind of power flow models and maximize the generation dispatch for existing and firm future resources for the load pocket or area that is under study. Then, based on the existing knowledge of our system and the engineering judgment, we establish plausible injection for future renewables. We then model the representative generators in the power flow models at these injection points, and then use the software called Terra, which is a low flow software, to perform the kind of transfer analysis. So we perform an optimal power flow transfer from the representative generators, what we will refer as a source in the transfer analysis, transfer to the generators external to the study area, what we refer as the sink in this analysis. So when we increase a generator by a certain amount, you have to reduce the generation on the system elsewhere to maintain the system balance. The software produces an optimal maximized dispatch for the representative generators, taking into consideration of both base case condition and N-1 contingencies. And this is what we noted as the capacity headroom. Each utilities provides a zonal headroom, which is aggregate of all the study point of the points of injection in each zone. So before we jump into more details, I want to emphasize that we want to emphasize some disclaimers associated with this study. So first thing is the headroom calculations are estimated value for the assumed study years and the projected system topology for the future. They should be treated as directional or as a guidance for magnitude of injection. Another disclaimer is that some injection points may look like they are plausible to interconnect for the resources, but when you start doing a deeper dive into detail, there might be limitation to the headroom, such as the physical feasibility or constraints external to the injection point. Another detail is that the analysis only considered thermal N-1 assessment, but there might be other limitations that we will expect to be captured in the NISO interconnection process for a proposed project in the future. So the latest headroom calculation were posted on August 1st, 2023, under the DPS webpage. And we have the zonal headroom for each zone in the appendix of this slide as well for you to review. For the first stage of the CGPP, we will be utilizing the data from the August 1st filing. There's some exceptions to this where the LIPA and the CONAD values were updated for their respective public policy projects. We'll be evaluating, providing updated headroom calculation unique to the scenarios in the stage 5 of the CGPP as well. So is there any question on what has been presented so far?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the presentation so far. Do the phase 1 and 2 upgrades, approval upgrades, are those upgrades included in the analysis, in the headroom data?
Actually, I want to, yes, for PSG Long Island, I think we don't have any I can only speak on behalf of PSG Long Island LIPA systems. So for we don't have phase 2 projects in our system, but I think phase 1 upgrades for the future non-firm projects has not been incorporated in this analysis due to it has not been approved by the DPS. But for other utilities, I would like to ask my JO colleagues to chime in.
This is Jeff Marr from National Grid. So in our last round of headroom calculations, I believe, yes, the phase 1 and phase 2 were included, yes.
Thank you, Jeff. So, and that's the case for NYSEG too, for instance, like Southern Tier, there are some phase 2 upgrades that were approved that should show higher headroom than if not included.
That is correct. Yeah, the phase 2 projects will be included for NYSEG as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. And maybe one other question on the methodology. So you noted that you are using Tara and starting with some generation that is in the MUD or some sources, some locations that are in the that you have selected, did you select those location based on some specific criteria? And how would that be opposed? How this approach would be different to, like, if you calculate the available transmission capacity by each zone, wouldn't that be more kind of like representative without being too specific to selecting specific locations?
Yeah, so for the point of interconnection selection, in our analysis, of course, it's based on kind of knowledge of our system and also the engineering judgment. So if you're talking about kind of zonal capacity headroom that just is calculated based on transmission system, I'm assuming that you will choose various or all the substations that in a zone and kind of scale up or create a point of interconnection of all this kind of substations. So from that perspective, we're not sure if it's a good kind of estimate for our kind of system, because we do have certain criteria about, for example, that like feasibility to create kind of terminal in those substation, and also kind of our engineering judgment. For example, we do choose certain locations that we think it will be possible for future interconnection, or high possibility for future interconnection comes into those locations. But overall, yes, is there some kind of knowledge base and also kind of engineering judgment building to those location selection?
And just to clarify, you think you are proposing this approach and you think this is better because you are pre-choosing the sites as opposed to a general ATC analysis for each zone?
Yeah, so I think voltage class is something that has been considered. So yes, so we choose to have certain kind of location based on that. And I think, yeah, we think it's probably a bad approach to select those plausible kind of injection points instead of choosing kind of all the substation in certain zone.
This is Nick Colbert. I can layer in some as well. I mean, at a high level, even with selecting more specific POIs, Terra transfer analysis provides a very optimal result, right? So we thought it prudent to also not just assume all POIs across our system, but rather kind of filter that down to at least those that we have confidence that their injections can be made to, and that there is some level of at least screening or understanding, whether through past interconnection projects or transmission projects within the utility, that suggests that these points of interconnection are actually feasible. Does that help answer your question, Radhika?
Yes, I guess in my head, I was trying to understand which is a better approach. One where you select locations, pre-select locations that may be different possibly from what the study may have in stage 2.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, it's a valid question. I think, like most anything, it's something we need to see how the results occur in this round, and to see if which is suggests any changes to that in the future. But at least for PSC Long Island, and I assume for other utilities as well, those interconnection points were very carefully chosen, and it wasn't just like one here and there. It was sufficient enough where it's spread out across the utility area, where you have some, and in turn, Terra was able to optimize those injection amounts.
And thank you. Okay, thank you. And that's like optimized across all those locations. So you do that analysis at the same time across all locations. Okay, now one at a time. Okay.
Correct.
Excuse me. Hi, this is Raya Salter from the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center with the question in this vein. So if it's all right, I'll pose it here. I'll take. So I'm just interested to know, I reviewed the August 1st filing in the docket, and, it does show the sort of high level analysis, but, how can we understand, pursuant to this, discussion that just happened, what went into this analysis in terms of feasibility, choosing or not choosing? How can we get some insight into exactly how that was done?
Yeah, right. That's a good question. I think I can speak on behalf of PSE Line on the LIPA system. So we do have certain consideration for kind of future feasibilities that is kind of built into those specifically for this one, actually, for the PPTM projects that will create potential kind of interconnection points on our 345 kV system. So those type of kind of consideration has built into that, and also based on kind of previous experience with interconnection with NISO process. So we do know that certain substation do have the or high interest or higher feasibilities compared to others to injection in for the injection point. So that's how we base those information, and we establish our kind of potential injection points in this analysis.
Thank you so much for that. Uh, Thank you so much for that. I'd be interested in, well, if folks could maybe comment a little bit into how that was done, and just wanting to encourage that we have as much transparency as possible, in this particular piece of the process. And as we look at these three scenarios, one which is sort of called lower impact, one is sort of called higher impact, and without being able to understand this, how folks are looking at the baseline, it's kind of hard to understand, where the analyses are going. And thank you so much for that. How do the other utilities could perhaps you just say a few words?
Yeah, I can speak up for NYSEG and RG&E. So for our process, it was generally an exclusion process. So we start with everything, all of our substations, and then take the approach of sort of station by station, considering if there were particular complexities that would preclude feasible interconnections or cost-effective interconnections. So, for example, for RG&E substations which are downtown or perhaps are very difficult to expand due to being a certain construction, such as a GIS construction, which may not lend itself to being feasible to expand, we would tend to rule those out, not because they're impossible, but because there's likely better options. So that was, I think, at a high level, the approach that we followed.
Jeff Marr from National Grid. We did something very similar to what Frank just discussed. But one additional piece I'll add to what he said is sometimes the headroom buses that we chose are kind of like a proxy, right? A proxy for generation to connect in that vicinity. It's not always going to be true that generators in upstate New York can or should connect into an existing substation. There may be better options for them that are closer to where they are physically constructing their facility that would make more sense for them to connect to. But when we sit down and we perform that analysis, we do that study work, it's impractical to study every possible interconnection point. The programs are just not set up in a way that would make that realistic in terms of computation time. So we have to narrow it down to a limited number of choices. We can't study everything. We can't study every possible combination. So that's why we kind of leaned on existing substations as a proxy for connecting generation into that vicinity. And like Frank said, sometimes those existing substations are in the middle of Rochester or Syracuse or Albany. And, it's extremely unlikely that we would see 500 megawatts of solar trying to connect in downtown Albany. So we screen out those substations that we just don't feel make practical sense because of their physical location. But then a lot of the stations across upstate New York remain on the list. A lot of our major switching stations, again, used as a proxy, are still allowed by the program to be considered as places where it could optimally add generation.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'd note that Jeff's point on those stations being viewed as proxies, that applies to NYSEG RG&E as well. So I appreciate Jeff making that point.
fair enough to Con Edison that that's the same is true for Con Ed?
It is.
All right. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Just thinking conceptually about some of the in say the Climate Action Council process, and we went there, and the CLCPA required some study about barriers and opportunities in particular in disadvantaged communities, some of which might be in these urban areas, and just thinking about where we can overcome those barriers. But I will leave that for another conversation. Thank you so much. That was just very, very helpful.
I'll
Thank
jump.
you. Any?
Jump.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, my hand up. I don't think I saw any other hands, so I'll jump in. This is Bill Acker with New York Best. My question is around how we should be thinking about the headroom data going forward, and how you all are thinking about the potential kind of overlap of different generating resources. And what I mean by that is that you presently have maybe 30% more generating capacity and load, maybe 40% peak load, generating capacity at peak load. We are projected by the Climate Action Council modeling to go from that 30-40% up to 3x or so. So in 2050, all the scenarios were around rough order of magnitude 150 gigawatts and 50 gigawatts of 150 gigawatts of generating capacity and 50 gigawatts of load. I mean, plus or minus a bit, but rough order of magnitude 3x the generating capacity to peak load. So clearly, we're never going to have all of those generators on at the same time, and that's reflective of the intermittent nature of most of those generators. And so, as I'm thinking about this, I think you're reflecting some of that in your power flow analysis with your sources and sinks. But I think the actual headroom analysis is then assuming full output, full nameplate output for the generators that are coming on, and clearly that's never going to be the case in the future. Where when we have 3x generating capacity to peak load, we're never going to be anywhere near full nameplate for most generators at the same time. And so I'm wondering how we should start to think about this going forward. Should we be thinking that the headroom calculation needs to change going forward? And as we think about it now, how do you view it for kind of the different resources? And to some extent, this gets to Raya's point of, yes, in certain locations, you're not going to build solar, but you might build an energy storage system. So we have to start thinking at some point about some of the differentiation of the resources going forward. And I'm just wondering if you could put some texture around how you folks think about this kind of not continuous nameplate output of the facilities going forward.
This is Jeff Maher from National Grid. I'll take a crack at that, at least from maybe at least National Grid's perspective, or maybe a little bit more upstate perspective. We'll see. I think the way we're looking at it right now is, if I say that there's 100 megawatts of headroom, what I'm essentially saying is I can support 100 megawatts of generation output. All right, so I don't necessarily care where that generation comes from or what it looks like. I'm agnostic to the technology. And in reality, kind of what I'm saying is it's almost like I know this sounds a bit strange, but it's like an instantaneous energy or instantaneous capacity output, right? So I'm saying I can support 100 megawatts of output. If that means that there's 1,000 megawatts of generation, all at 10% output, and that's where I'm getting my 100 megawatts from, that's fine with me. I can support that. What I can't support, though, is if I say there's 100 megawatts of headroom, I can't support 200 megawatts of simultaneous output from all the generation, right? I can only support 100 megawatts. So what we're really reporting, at least the way I look at it, is we're not reporting the nameplate capability we can support. We're reporting how much essentially energy we can deliver out of that pocket of the system. And again, I don't care. I don't care
That
where
makes a
that's
lot of
coming.
sense. That makes a lot of sense, Jeff. And I guess and maybe I don't know if it's still in the slide deck or it said nameplate. Maybe rephrasing that a bit, because I think it does make a lot of sense. It then gets to the related question, which is you're reporting headroom at different times, which I think is helpful in starting to think about that. So in the appendix, and in the other previous studies, you're looking at light load, peak winter, peak summer. And clearly the needs will be very, very different there. And so I guess, as we're starting to think about this, as we constrain the model, if we're going to use this headroom data to constrain the model, are you going to constrain off the binding light load times, which seem to be the binding times for most of the things in the appendix? Or is there more the different means where you're going to constrain the model for the capacity build out?
We had talked with the NISO about trying to do more time frames, and that was becoming very challenging. We're just not sure the computations would work with time sensitive headroom. So for the capacity expansion model, I think we settled on just using the most limiting headroom case.
Okay. All right. So that's something we probably have to watch, because I would expect that's going to overestimate the constraint. But I can understand why you do it.
Yes, assuming the headroom becomes binding, it may or not be binding even in some zones. In some zones like land use or just bulk transfer capability, something else could be binding before the headroom. So yeah, we'll be watching for the output to see when and under what conditions really the headroom does become binding.
Okay, great, thank you.
This is Chi from the NISO. So I also want to jump into the point that Jeff just made. In terms of the headroom being the time, so let's think through the application of this headroom data. At first, we have these bus informations, we have this power flow analysis, and then coming out feeding into capacity expansion. And then from the capacity expansion, once we know the numbers, then we got it translated back into nodal, so that in the power flow analysis, it can be analyzed. So I guess in my mind is that the methodology, however, way that how the methodology that we have now is like the utility is saying, this is currently the most limiting way to link that all into one single thread. But in the future, the thought about having the time variable, that may be something that something we can consider in the future. But I do understand that right now the headroom is considering the most limiting case.
And I'm sorry to just one last question, just for both of you, just as you use the headroom as the constraint in the capacity expansion model, it was just described that the headroom isn't really necessarily going to limit. In the case of 100 megawatts of headroom, if you had a 100 megawatt solar project and 100 megawatt wind project, they might still both go forward in that same effective location in the future. How are you doing that in the capacity expansion model? How are you not saying once you have a 100 megawatt solar project coming in that it binds to the next 100 megawatt wind project?
For the upstate system, we are essentially treating it as an energy limit and not a capacity limit.
Okay.
For each of the time slices, they're looking at treating it as an energy limit.
Hey everyone, this is Sarah Karkner from the NISO. I just wanted to chime in as well. So for the capacity expansion model too, what Jeff said is absolutely correct, and just wanted to offer a little bit more that The headroom will be implemented as a soft constraint. So it will have the option, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the future slides as well, but the model will have the option to increase that headroom at an associated cost. So we can talk about that more on the future slides, but just wanted to offer that now that it's not a hard constraint, and the model will have the ability to increase that headroom at an associated cost.
This is Dave Rupert with TransSource Energy. As I'm listening to the conversations, for me it just brings up that we need to be looking at some other sensitivities in the three models, and mostly toward intra and interzonal transmission constraints that need to be relaxed, because this is going to just result in each TO looking at their own headroom and capabilities, but it's not going to look at the greater system. I understand that it will, in the modeling that's going to be done, but I think those constraints need to be relaxed so you can determine where the flows are going to go based on those optimal locations of new generating resources. If we don't take that into account, we're just not going to see what the possibilities are.
So we do plan to look at as potential sensitivities, relaxing bulk limitations, relaxing the size of the pipes between the bubbles in order to see if that meaningfully changes the build out of generation. So that is definitely on the list to look at those sensitivities for relaxing the bulk transfer capabilities. And then as Sarah mentioned, in terms of looking within the bubbles, the relaxing that we're considering is adding headroom, but it comes at a cost. So the model will be able to consider the value of additional headroom in comparison to other options that the program is given, such as siting generation in other zones, and decide if increasing headroom is the optimal way to build out the system.
And how's that accomplished in the modeling, Jeff?
We're going to give headroom a cost. So if the program decides that it's cheaper to expand headroom and build generation in zone A compared to moving that generation to zone B, that's what it would do. It would pick the most optimal or most cost-effective path forward, which could be adding headroom.
So how does that square against what the development community evaluates as optimal locations? In other words, you could go ahead in a void and say, well, let's go ahead and put more generation here, but how do you know whether or not the development community is going to follow that? Or are you getting more toward a model of saying, here are the optimal locations, developers, you need to start the land rush to figure out how you're going to build that into those locations?
I think it's some of both, right? We're trying to guess what developers will do, and we don't know. And we don't know where they might find that land, right? Developers are going to go where it makes most financial sense for them to go. And we have no control over that. We have no visibility into that. The headroom calculations are an attempt to inform developers where we believe system capability exists to support their generation. But we don't know if land is incredibly expensive in that vicinity of where we're identifying headroom. There may be zero interest from developers to go into the locations that we have flagged as optimal. We can only give part of that equation, and that's the electrical side of it.
Right.
So we do view this as an ever evolving, right? This is a cyclical process. As developers come in, as developers move through the process, they get NYSERDA contracts, they make it through the interconnection queues, whatever the milestones are, we'll see more and more developer behavior in areas where developers believe that it's most economic. We'll incorporate those updates into each cycle of the model and then build off of that.
Makes sense. Do you think that the existing queues have any foresight into where developers feel like it's most advantageous for them to develop at this time?
The existing queue, we do believe that it is an indicator of where there's interest. It's not always, well, sometimes developers go fishing, right? Sometimes they're
They're
looking around.
speculators, right?
Yeah,
Developers are speculators, so they're not gonna try to buy Manhattan property to put something down. They're gonna go out and put options on the cheapest land that's as close to a 230 or 138 or 345 line. That's what they do, right? So it's pretty indicative of where developers, as they're speculating, where they would most likely want to put their product that's going to be the cheapest cost to them.
Hey, can I add something? It's Liz from DPS. And Dave, I don't know if you've been following, the conversations for as long as they've been going on, but the primary purpose of CGP is not to tell generation developers where to go. The primary purpose of CGPP is to give the commission the collective's best guess about where to invest in transmission.
Yeah, I get that, Liz.
And the corollary is that, developers will follow.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I'm just trying to figure out whether or not the analysis without relaxing those constraints, intra and interzonal, whether it gives the right insight. Without those relaxations or increasing the pipe diameters or whatever analogy you want to use, I just think that has to be part of the as sensitivities to part of the three models. And I don't know whether or not, Jeff illuminated pretty well, but I don't know whether or not that's what the consensus of the community has decided is going to be some of the sensitivities. So I'm just putting a marker out there that I think that needs to be memorialized, that as the models are developed, there needs to be those relaxation of constraints as sensitivities, considerations, whatever word we want to put on it.
Dave, this is Jason from the NYSO. I can say we generally would support that kind of sensitivity and wouldn't be too complex to run. But we certainly do have constraints on the number of sensitivities we can run. So I think it'd have to be kind of a collective agreement on it. I would add, it's important to put context to why we're doing the headroom constraints within the capacity expansion model. And if you go back to the CGPP order, the original recommendation that happened was to not include headroom constraints or any kind of subzonal constraint and let the capacity expansion model build out in a manner that did not recognize it, and then to continue on with power flow, production costs, and other modeling after that. I believe the commission came out and indicated that they wanted a little more guidance from the capacity expansion model instead of ignoring the fact that there are localized constraints, have some guidance and have that be kind of our headroom mechanism. So it's important to recognize that this isn't the only shot that we have at kind of analyzing the system at a very detailed level. And in fact, it's mostly meant to generally guide where generation would build. So once that guidance happens through the capacity expansion model, we then have, stages 2 through 6, where we do much more in-depth analysis. So I just want to make sure it's contextual into what the headroom's used for, in making sure everyone knows this isn't the only shot to look at where congestion is happening, where constraints are happening, and what kind of generation is impacted by those.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jason. I looked at the headroom constraint analysis as kind of the primer to all the other activities they have to do. So I would hope that it's not the penultimate or the ultimate, but instead it's the primer to the other pieces of the analysis that have to be put together to analyze the grid.
That sounds reasonable. But definitely your suggestion at running some form of relaxed headroom constraint sensitivity would let you know what the local constraints are doing and how local constraints are causing movement of build out among zones.
Right.
So I think that's what you're aiming at, and
Yep.
it seems like a reasonable sensitivity.
Yep. That's it.
And I fully support that. And I think if we go back to that, I'm just adding my voice to what David has said about the need for sensitivities on those headroom values. Because if we look at the power supply analysis, I was trying to look back to the documents that were provided in the EPAC process, like for instance, the PA power advisory supply curve. If we take the zone E example, I'm seeing over 35 gigawatts of solar resource potential in zone E. But when we look at the headroom values, the headroom will be limiting. You will not be seeing probably more than 2.3 gigawatts based on the headroom values. In zone E, which is from the supply resource potential analysis, is the zone with most resources, most potential for resource development.
Just one comment on that. Just remember that the headroom numbers are not a nameplate capability. It's kind of like an instantaneous energy output.
Yes. Will be, I guess I think someone from New York ISO said that it's a soft constraint. Will be good to have some view on when that soft constraint is reached or how close you are with that. Yeah, to see what are we actually getting to close to those values.
Yeah, we agree. You know, the utilities did some work. When was it? Almost 2 years ago now. We called it our phase 2B assessment, and we did use headroom constraints, and we learned a lot from that exercise. And that was one of the takeaways from that work was, at least for that iteration, which had totally different assumptions for just about everything in the model. So granted, we don't know for sure if this will be true this time around, but it was very interesting from that work that many of the cases were not limited by the headroom values. So we are very interested to see output from this analysis to see when and where those headroom values do become binding. So we do expect to be sharing that once we get there.
If I may, this is Raya Salter, Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. This seems like another example where, at the very least, tracking where this sensitivity may overlay with disadvantaged communities criteria or the energy communities criteria, because of of subsidies that are aimed at these areas that may be taken advantage of, state and federal, and that there may be public policy interventions that are designed to focus in on those areas which may not meet maybe the initial definition of what you saw, how you looked at what was economic. But I guess that's a statement and also a question. Do you think that, that could be helpful to sort of track that kind of info?
We've started discussing like what we could do or how we could do some of this stuff with those zones that you mentioned. Thing to keep in mind is we're taking our headroom numbers and we're rolling them up on a zonal basis, a New York control area zone. So, for example, Zone C. Zone C is a huge geographic area covering, Finger Lakes, the Southern Tier, the Syracuse area, Oswego, right? So there's a very large geographic area. And I believe there's quite a few disadvantaged communities within that zone. So at least when we do capacity expansion modeling, translating this big, huge zonal limitation into an impact on these very small disadvantaged communities that are spread throughout the zone is a potential challenge, but that we're talking through how we could do that.
I think that's helpful. And I think I love, maybe at a future time, talk a bit more about what you're thinking there. And that initially, at least sort of tracking some of this info so that, it can potentially be overlaid in future iterations is also one other concept. But thank you very much.
Yeah, just again to build a little bit more on that, just because I want this is a kind of a hot button topic for us lately. We're struggling to figure out how to do it. We're kind of in the early stages of discussing it. This effort where we're doing the capacity expansion modeling, that essentially doing this at the big zonal level, may actually not be the place that would be best to do some of that discussion and accounting. When we move into future stages of CGPP, we'll be placing these generators into specific points in the system. We're still discussing the methodology for how we would decide where those placements are. But when we get there, like those specific placements, we may be able to figure out if those are within those like disadvantaged communities and other zones. So that might be a better place to have that discussion, not here in the capacity expansion models, but we're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I hear and appreciate that. And just intuitively, if we, just in the context of this, like relaxing the constraint conversation, because if we're not sort of taking that into account now, then we won't, the generation that's placed later may not be fit to purpose, although, there could be some backward analysis as well. But I understand that you're talking through that, and I look forward to also being a part of that conversation. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I do have one more clarification question on the self-constraint concept and how that works in the model. Is this still a good time to have that question clarified?
Actually, yeah, it seems like we have a lot of interest on the headroom use in the CapEx model, so maybe it's a good time for us to shift to that. So yeah, with that, actually, I'm going to hand over the presentation to my colleague from Con Ed, William, to continue the presentation.
Before you move on,
yeah.
Sorry, this is Bill Ackner, my question is actually on this slide. We have the statement here that all the scenarios will use the same headroom data, and the more I'm thinking about that, I'm getting a little concerned about that, because if your binding for the headroom data is the light load springtime, then you're going to be very, very sensitive to the load scenarios for the headrooms, and if we have different scenarios that have different load scenarios, we could accidentally cause headroom binding that's not real in some of the higher generation, higher load scenarios, higher electric load scenarios. And so have you done any checks to see how different that would be between scenarios? And maybe that could be an action item you guys just take back, just to do a quick sanity check on the assumption that we use the same headroom for all the scenarios.
So Bill, we spent some time talking about this, and what we actually decided was it's just impossible to create headroom numbers for each case. And the reason it's impossible is because you need that system representation. You need those models to run those simulations on. And those models are created in stage 2 of CGPP. So we can't have the model results in stage 1 because we don't have the models until stage 2. So it's impossible for us to run it. even if it was possible for run it, like when you guys look at the August 1st filing or the February 1 filing where we report out headroom numbers, a significant amount of time is spent working on that. I mean, weeks, maybe month, 2 months worth of analysis goes into those reports, into generating those numbers. So not only do we need the base cases, which won't exist until stage 2, but we would need months worth of time actually to perform those calculations, even if we did have them. So it's just unfortunately impossible for us to do that.
Yes, thanks for this question. So with that, yes, I will hand over to William to continue the presentation.
Thanks. How if you want to go to the next slide?
I was just starting to say, I appreciate the challenge of doing it, but we still should understand the ramifications to the capacity build-out model. Because I mean, months worth of work is one thing, billions of dollars is another, and that's what we're investing here. So I would encourage you to just make sure we've checked it. Thank you.
So what
Wait, it's Liz. Maybe I'm really off the rails here, but my understanding of headroom is it's a description of it's sort of an existing system description, and wouldn't you want to use the same thing in each scenario? Otherwise, you're chipping away at any possibility of having apples to apples comparisons.
No, I don't think it's correct, Liz. If the load goes up locally and generation goes up locally, I mean, imagine this is not obviously this is a very idealized case, but imagine a situation where you raised load exactly where you're putting the generation in exact sync with the generation. You wouldn't need any change to transmission, but the headroom would look like you couldn't put that generation in. And so it is important. I agree with the challenges in doing it, and I don't want to derail this meeting. I realize we've had a lot of conversation on it, but I do think it's important if we are going to change our capacity build out based on the headroom, which sounds like we're doing. And we're going to have to make a proxy for headroom, it sounds like, but we should at least know if our proxy is way off or not for the other scenarios.
Bill, again, it's impossible to do it without the stage 2 cases. I mean, I want to be crystal clear about that. It's literally impossible. But what we could do for the first cycle is I think we're going to be doing headroom calculations later in the process, like in stage 5. So as we kind of finish off the first cycle, we could look at that and see, here's what we started with originally for headroom. Here's what we ended up finding for headroom for our different cases, and we could have some discussion about what to do in future cycles. That may be possible.
That sounds good, Jeff. Thank you.
And I think the big piece here is if those constraints are met, no? Because we have some values, and you said it represents the capacity, the energy at that time, not the nameplate capacity of resources. So I think it's very important for all of us to understand if those headroom values are met in the model, those constraints are reached. If they are reached, the next question seems to be like, is this a real constraint or not, depending on the scenario? Because the model, I think based on that soft constraint definition, the model will go and will choose to build capacity in a different zone, but in reality, you may still have a lot of development in one particular area, so it will shift, in the model, it will shift transmission and generation development to a different zone than what may be happening in reality.
Yeah, you just, I think someone mentioned this earlier, that just to reiterate this, originally our proposal was not to use headroom because there are trade-offs, and this is one of those trade-offs, is yes, if you are overly conservative or overly constraining in one zone, it'll force generation into another zone. So the way we're kind of dealing with that is we are giving the model the ability to expand headroom. That's why it's a soft constraint. Again, we're just trying to balance the pros and cons of all these issues here. So we're trying to put what we think is a reasonable constraint on the model, which is these headroom estimates. We're giving the model a reasonable opportunity to expand headroom before it goes somewhere else. And then we are in stage 5 going to be looking at this all over again, right? In stage 5, we come back to capacity expansion modeling, we come back to headroom, we relook at the models, we relook at the cost of transmission investment, and there in stage 5, it'll help us understand, you know, is what we propose, is what we assumed reasonable? Is the transmission needs that come out of those assumptions reasonable? So there is an iteration here that will give us a second chance to kind of think through some of those things. And of course, CGPP itself is cyclical. And if we have lessons learned that come out of this first cycle that this didn't work very well, or even something about it, some component, some assumption just didn't work very well, we can always revisit that in future CGPP cycles.
Would the expectation be that if you if you reach the constraint, you allow the model to add headroom at this cost that we'll be talking in a few minutes, but the model will go to a different zone that doesn't have that cost of headroom added, no? Unless there are significant differences in NCF, the model will go to a different zone because it's cheaper to build in a different zone than to add the cost of the headroom in that zone.
If the generation costs were equal in the two zones, yes, when it bumps against the headroom constraint, it would go to the other zone first before trying to build out headroom. That's correct.
Yeah, I'm repeating my statement, but I think it will be really important if New York ISO could provide some of these insights. If any preliminary runs were done, it's like where you are in a situation where you get close to the headroom, or if you don't get close to the headroom, at least the discussion can be paused for now, for this stage maybe, or at least for the first scenario, because the discussion would be moot if the headroom values are not met, are not reached.
Yeah, right. If headroom is never binding, then right, this is a non-issue. But I mean, I think the headroom will end up be binding, at least in some places. I think compared to the last time we did this type of analysis with an ISO, we have more physical capability for generation to be in some of these zones. Before, we were seeing like land use limits that were a little more binding than headroom. So yeah, we the utilities are also very interested in seeing this. I think not to throw the NISO out there, but I think they're starting to work on the capacity expansion modeling. They're going to be doing the state scenario as part of their system and resource outlook. That's probably going to be the first one where there will be some headroom limits that were considered. So we'll be looking, I think, at that scenario first, just to see as an indicator how this is working.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no other questions, I'll go through the remainder of the slides. So as you're by now aware, the capacity expansion model that we're working with operates on a zonal basis, and we're using the concept of electrical headroom to represent intra-zonal limitations. The model within a zone will have the option to use existing headroom first, and then it can choose to add additional headroom at a cost. In this particular case, existing headroom costs $0, and adding headroom costs $389 per kilowatt. This number comes from the CAC integration analysis. It's the single number that corresponds to the annualized number that's in that particular report. And the joint utilities reviewed this number against recent projects and believe it to be appropriate for use within this study. I will note that in stage 5 of CGPP, we will be rerunning the capacity expansion model using the actual project cost. And so the $389 figure is it's a placeholder for now in stage 1 of CGPP. Before I go on to explain how we're going to use this number, are there any questions on the 389 figure itself?
Could you just where is that in the? I'm very curious to understand the basis of it. So that's from the scoping document integration analysis. That was an average cost of transmission build out, or what was that number?
Correct. It comes from the CAC integration analysis. I believe there's like a $37.8 per kilowatt year in that particular figure. And we asked staff for the corresponding number that's like the actual investment cost of it, and that's where the 389 figure comes from. So it's effectively like a New York study of prior projects to come up with that. Does that answer your question? Or?
Yep, that helps. Thank you.
Any other questions on the number, or we can go to the next slide?
Maybe one point of, maybe one question on that value. With across regions, there might be differences now based on voltage level of the expansion needed, and maybe cost of capital and human cost, I guess. So is there any thought about refining those values to be more regional, more zone, like to represent each zone?
Yes. So what I would say is the CAC integration analysis also used the constant value across all the different zones. We did put some thought into this, and we looked at the project cost. And what we found is that there's quite a bit of variation in project cost. You know, if you have a small project, the dollars per kilowatt may be very high relative to a large project. Similarly, you may have expansion potential on an already existing facility that's much cheaper than building a brand new one. And so it actually didn't necessarily correspond to zones as well, as much as just project to project variability. And given that, we thought about applying zonal cost multipliers based on generator costs or something like that, but we decided just for simplicity here, use a constant value across the different zones. Any follow-ups or other questions? If not, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so the goal of capacity expansion modeling is to find the least cost resource build-out that meets state goals as well as other policy targets. Because adding electrical headroom to the system represents a real cost, by including it in the model, we can find the build-out that minimizes the sum of generation as well as headroom costs. And as we'll see in the example after this, the end result of this is to spread the generation build-out across zones, leading to a more consistent answer. We talked about a little bit about this earlier on. Headroom can be implemented in the model two different ways, on an energy basis or on a capacity basis. The capacity basis is the simpler of the two. It directly limits the amount of renewable addition to the available headroom. It's appropriate, for example, when the points of interconnection are the limiting factor on the system, because certainly within that year, you know, that one particular type of resource is going to hit 100% output. And if you were going to curtail it, you would likely do it earlier on, for example, in the inverter or something like that, rather than the interconnection itself. The energy approach to headroom, which is what Jeff Mayer was talking about earlier, allows you to overbuild the renewable generation relative to the headroom. And it takes into account the fact that the capacity factors for those resources are less than 100%. And in particular, when you're looking at a diversity of different resources, so wind, solar, hydro, that aren't necessarily outputting 100% at the same time, you can basically have overbuild the renewables relative to the headroom numbers. I do have an example on the next slide, which I'll go into, but are there any quick questions on this slide? If not, we
well,
can go to
I guess just I thought I was getting comfortable with the energy approach for renewables, but this is Bill Ackman here, Best again. But I want to just play this forward for a CAC long model where you've got 3x generation to load. So we're clearly not going to want to build our transmission system to carry the 3x generation. And so the energy approach starts to get there, but I think it still doesn't really get there, right? In the sense that, you know, if you say I've got a 20% capacity factor on my you know, solar, and a 30 or 40 on my wind, and I start adding all those things up, I'm still going to have more generation than I'm ever going to need for load. And because, you know, if everything was making power at the same time, you wouldn't have the problems. And I want to make sure we've thought about that going forward, because I have a feeling that we're still starting to head toward this having. And I realize it's not simple. I realize you guys are doing a good job with this, and I'm not being critical, but I want to make sure we're thought through. Should we, going forward, be thinking somewhat differently on the headroom. Maybe that's not for this iteration, but the next iteration of the project. But I just want to make sure we've asked that question.
I definitely think it's something that we will think more on, and we can certainly follow up on. In terms of what you're talking about, the output of the different renewable resources, we tend to look at that in 8.760s, where you're looking at all hour in the year, and you have correlation between different resource types based on some historical weather pattern. Yeah, the challenge is when you go from that type of analysis, which can be done to a limited extent in capacity expansion, but more so in production cost, to the power flow, and being able to say like what particular incident time are we modeling. So there's a lot of complexity to it, and I think we probably need to take that one back.
Yep, that'd be good if you did, because yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah. If there are no questions, we can go on to the next example slide. Yeah, so to quickly illustrate how the headroom is used within the model, I created a simple example that has two zones, Zone A and Zone B. Both zones have 1,200 megawatts of renewable potential. In Zone B, the renewables are slightly more expensive at $1,200 per kilowatt versus $1,000 per kilowatt in Zone A. And Zone B also has slightly more existing headroom at 500 megawatts versus 300 megawatts in Zone A. And then for this particular example, I'm going to assume that the demand is 1,000 megawatts. And so the solution on the left represents what happens when you don't take headroom into account. The model will choose to build all 1,000 megawatts in Zone A because it has the lowest generator cost. But what we'll find is the first 300 use existing headroom, but the next 700 you have to pay that 389 figure, even though the model is not taking it into account. If we do include headroom within the model, you get the solution that's shown on the right there, where it chooses to build the first 300 megawatts in Zone A, similar to the previous solution, but then it chooses to build the next 500 megawatts in Zone B using existing headroom, because $1,200 for the slightly more expensive renewable, but using existing headroom is still cheaper than the $1,389, which is what it costs to build in Zone A and add headroom. And so, yeah, so we have your 300 in Zone A, your 500 in Zone B, and then you have to add 200 more, which is built in Zone A because it is the cheaper zone, totaling 1,000 megawatts of total generation. And so what we can see is that the end result of adding the headroom to the model is that it spreads the build out between zones, leading to a more consistent answer, as well as it is also a slightly more cost optimal one when you take into account the headroom cost. It ends up saving, I think, around $95 million. In this particular example right here. With that, I'm happy to take any questions on the economic part of the presentation. The quiet group, got all your questions out of the way?
To me, this example, Radhika here, that it does show how the model could go and choose optimally based on the input values, headroom, versus what could be potential interest from the renewable community or the PA advisory supply curve, because maybe we will see a lot more. That blue line is longer. You can build more renewables in one particular area that require a different type of transmission expansion than a system that is shown with multiple buckets coming from across all the zones.
Yeah, and I think this is a simplified example. In the actual model itself, I think we have county level economic data that comes from a recent NYSERDA study on this. And so there's much more granularity in the actual model.
This is Radhika from Energy. I have my hand raised. Radhika, you have a question? You want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Radhika. Go ahead.
So what is the average cost for 1,200 megawatt here overall?
I can go for we were not actually building 1,200 megawatts. We're only building 1,000 megawatts. You want the average cost of it?
Yeah. What is the average cost in both the scenarios? I'm trying to compare and understand the impact here.
Yeah. So what I can say is, in the scenario on the left, the total cost is 1.272 billion, and the one on the right, the total cost is 1.177 billion. And then we can divide that by 1,000 to get your per megawatt cost.
Yeah. Okay. I think this is very simplistic, as you have indicated, and thank you very much, Bill, for making this very simple and making us understand. But when you have multiple zones, this is A and B, two of them, but if you have multiple zones, how would the model choose considering various flows and transfers? Like you are connected between Con Ed, Long Island, and Zone K and everything, right? How does this model prioritize which zone to choose next from A, B, C?
Yeah, so I'd say that's why we're using the capacity expansion model. So like when you get to the level of complexity that we're looking at, it's not something I can illustrate easily on a figure. But the capacity expansion model knows the cost in all the different zones. It knows the transmission limits. It knows the policy targets. It knows the reliability targets. And it's effectively a cost minimization algorithm subject to all the constraints. And it will find the best solution to it.
I'm going to that objective function and the constraints because that dictates the output. The cost minimization is surely good, but the constraint decide what would be the outcome, like any other algorithm. So your constraint here, as you're demonstrating, is the limit on the headrooms, one. And what are the constraints would the model consider when dealing with this? What other things will be considered?
Yes, I mean, in terms of constraints, it's not an exhaustive list, but you have the policy targets, 70 by 30, 100 by 40, those are needed. You have reliability targets, you need to have, read the LCR, IRMs. You need to, for example, you have resource potentials in the different zones. You can only build so much wind before you've saturated all the available land. I'm sure there's more of them I haven't come up with. The transmission limits between different zones, effectively a full description of the system as we have it.
Thank you, Bill.
Hi, this is Xiaojian from NIPA. I also have a question about this zonal headroom limit. My question is, for example, Zone A, Zone B headroom limit. How did you get this zonal limit? I recall for the headroom analysis, you have a lot of pocket headroom. Do you just add those headrooms each pocket in one zone, adding together as a total, as a zonal headroom limit, or you did the individual calculation for each zone? You came up a zonal headroom limit.
Yeah, so I'll say the first half of this presentation covered like how we come up with the headroom numbers on a zonal basis, and I would defer to them as to how exactly they come up with the number in that. But yeah, that's effectively where the headroom comes, and it's a soft constraint. As you see in the model, you can basically pay to increase it.
So I think the answer to your question is we use the analysis that was posted on August 1st, and you're right that those were in pockets, not really a zonal number. So we went back to the analysis. We put all the buses that had headroom into the appropriate zones, and we just summed it up. So the numbers do come right out of the August 1 report, but we had to do some summations to get them correctly allocated into the correct zones.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sometimes I have a concern, if you're just adding the pocket number up, use that number as your zonal number, that's probably going to be overestimated the limit, because when you calculate the one pocket, you disregard the constraint. So you get a pretty good number. So similar, you do another pocket, you're doing the same thing. However, when you do the overall zonal limit, that number may be smaller than the sum up number.
That is a fair comment. We did consider that the number, when you sum it up the way we did, may be a little bit too high. We decided that, again, that the headroom is kind of a high-level indicator of how much transmission capability is likely in a zone. And we really didn't want that number to be overly conservative or overly constraining. So we decided that given that that's the numbers we had, that's the numbers we could use, we feel it's a reasonable approximation of the total zonal headroom.
And in context, we selected that number as the lowest headroom of the seasonal load values we selected. So it already is sort of biased to be a lower number. So to a certain extent, some of these simplifying assumptions are going to cancel each other out.
I guess just Bill Acker again, just following up on that. I mean, we raised this earlier, the concern about that being too conservative. Am I right in understanding how much did you say the difference was between the no limit and the total limit in it was 1.1 versus about 1.3 billion?
Yeah, the difference I think is $95 million. I mean, the numbers in this example are just made up, but
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think, I mean, this demonstrates how important this is, and it demonstrates that it can make a sizable difference. And it sounds like in this example, you know, if zone A, you know, had 300 megawatts or well, it's more than 300 megawatts, but some number of megawatts more load in strategic areas, that would change the outcome dramatically. So I do suspect that the different scenarios, you know, you suddenly put more electric vehicles and heat pumps all over the place, and suddenly things change. So it really hammers home to me the need for us to do a check on, you know, because $100 million is real money. So and I understand this is really challenging, but I do think we owe it to ourselves to do some of these checks. And you know what was discussed earlier about maybe it isn't in stage 5 where we go back and circle around on it, because you can't necessarily do it right now. But I don't think we should lose that, because you know, the difference in could be very substantial.
You know, just to be fair, you know, we did construct this example to illustrate the point, right? So if it wasn't noticeable, it wouldn't have been worth our time to show it. So you know, we made this up. All these numbers are made up. It's just really here to reinforce how this would work in the model.
Yep.
Jeff, maybe
Is there any consideration? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Maybe just one point, like maybe one sensitivity could be what utilities have proposed in the original CGPP filing about like only not include those, just to see the bookend. Maybe that's one option to see how impactful those limits are.
I'm not sure I follow.
So the initial proposal was to not include those headroom values, to assume the system unconstrained. So doing a sensitivity to an unconstrained system will give you the kind of like the bookend of like how the system will look like, or how the capacity expansion plan will look like if you ignore those.
Okay, I see. If we were to do a sensitivity, one possible sensitivity would be no headroom limits, essentially.
Yes, that could be maybe the extreme one, but just to see where the most changes are.
To the extent that NYISO could run it, I think it would be a valid sensitivity to run. And it'd be pretty simple as well. You change one number in the model and you let it run.
This question probably gets to the scope of the Advanced Technology Working Group for the CGPP, but is there any consideration about how you'll consider large amounts of energy storage increasing the headroom? You know, obviously, if we have 6 gigawatts storage goal for 2030, you know, the modeling, the CAC modeling, you know, goes out to 12 to 15 gigawatts of storage. That can dramatically increase the headroom. I don't think we know how to put that in the models yet, but is that something that would be taken back to the Advanced Technology Group?
Hey, Bill, the only role that we've been pressing the Advanced Technology Group to take with CGPP is to weigh in on the solution development phase. So we haven't asked them to collaborate with their JU counterparts in setting up these models.
Okay. So then I guess the question to the JU then is, how would you consider the large amounts of storage impact on headroom? Because they, clearly if you had a lot of storage here to take up the over generation, you would have more headroom.
So I think what we're going to be doing in stage 3 is identifying fit for purpose solutions, right? So we're looking for a solution that addresses the need and does it most cost effectively, essentially. So if storage can address the need most cost effectively, that would be the solution we would pick. So we would identify how much headroom that storage resource adds to the system, and then that would be considered in stage 5, right? So cost of that project and headroom created, and that doesn't matter if it's a wired solution, non-wired solution, whatever it is. We'll be looking for how much headroom is created and what the cost of creating that headroom is. So again, if storage is the most cost-effective way to create that headroom, then that's what we'll be proposing through stage 3.
Okay.
Can I probe on something? Bring it back to what might happen in the stage 1 modeling. You mentioned we're doing the energy headroom, and so there's certain times of the day where storage might be charging, and so in that hour the energy impact at the location would be lower, and so in that hour it might theoretically look like there's more headroom. So is there a chance that the fact that we're using the energy headroom limitations might indirectly capture some of the value storage is providing?
I'm pausing because I remember a month or so ago, we were discussing the use of headroom and how it may be, we'd be looking at the net of generation and storage and then applying the headroom limit against that net of generation and storage. But does anybody else remember the specifics of the discussion we had? All right, I think we're gonna have to check our notes, but so we can think about that one more. But we were going down that path of considering the net of generation and storage as what was applying against the headroom limit.
Yeah, that sounds right, and I think there's a distinction to be made between like the headroom quantity. Storage obviously impacts that, because if you have 1,000 megawatts of injection capability at a certain hour, if storage is injecting, it needs to count and reduce that headroom number. But the opposite is also true. And so it makes sense that if we're using the net of storage and renewable injections, it would also count the negative storage injections and maybe cover this. But I guess we'll have to take this back and check on it.
Yeah, right. Because you're jogging my memory a little bit, right? I think we were discussing the idea that if we say that there's 100 megawatts of headroom, we again are kind of technology agnostic. So in the middle of the night and there's no solar and there's no wind, we still only have 100 megawatts of headroom, and that headroom limitation would still apply against storage discharge into the system. We could only support 100 megawatts of storage discharge, because that's all the system can support in any hour, is the delivery of 100 megawatts of whatever it is. So again, we'll take that back and figure out where we left that discussion. But yeah, we were discussing it.
Yeah, I think the challenge, and where Skylar was just getting to, is that in that scenario you just were painting, if the storage is addressing the constraint on the headroom, i.e., it's absorbing the renewables at the light load point where that's the binding constraint you're finding here, then it's not just a simple matter of saying the storage is just like every other generator and it contributes to the 100 megawatts. It actually increases that 100 megawatt number. And so it does get a little more complex. And I guess my concern here, and I don't see a fix, and I'm not asking you guys necessarily to fix it, but my concern here is that because of the iterative nature of this process, you know, we're going to use the headroom to determine the resource mix. And we might have moved things out of zones that we didn't have to move because the storage in that zone might have fixed the problem for the headroom. And so I don't know how we get at that, but we got to be aware of it and think about it.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. We agree that this was an issue we wanted to resolve.
This is Radha Surya representing GIPNI from Invenergy. I have one more comment on this. As I was thinking through and hearing the discussion here, if you have a certain zone which is rich in renewables and they are interconnecting right now, okay, and you're applying these headroom limits, but the whole process of EPAC, you know, is to build transmission to support those renewables so that they can get delivered, the cheaper renewables delivered to the zones where you have the load. How do you balance that by this limitation? Because as your limit is implemented, your costs are going up. Probably the generation which are cheaper in one zone might not benefit, while you know, because of the headroom, but something else might benefit. You see that balance I'm trying to get to? How do you get to that balance? How do you minimizing the cost is important, but at the same time, you need to consider the renewables at the higher potential, right?
So what we're trying to do is balance this. We agree it is a balance, and different people may draw the line in different places, but let's imagine that renewable developers were only interested in putting generation in Zone A, Western New York. That's it. There was no other interest in any other zones in the state, Zone A only. But that was going to cost $100 billion in transmission investment in order to use that generation in Zone A across all of New York State's electric system, right? That doesn't really make sense. It makes more sense to acknowledge that the developers have interest in certain areas, but there are also places that might make more sense electrically or from a market perspective or for whatever other reason, or reliability issues or you know, capacity needs, whatever it is. There may be reasons that generators should site in specific areas. So we're trying to balance generator interest or developer interest versus system need or system of capability. And this is an attempt to get a better distribution of where the resources are ending up, you know, acknowledging where there's system capability and use that first. But to the extent that the lower cost generation, it would make sense to expand transmission capability. That's why this is a soft limit, so the generation can go into areas where it might make more sense to them, even if it costs a little bit in transmission investment. So yeah, this is an attempt to balance those two ideas.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I really understand where you're coming at. You know, it's a reliability versus markets or economics. But are you citing, and I agree this is going to be a big citing discussion after the fact, where there are projects which are already with have contracts with NYSERDA, I suppose, or they are in a queue process where are well ahead, and you know the cluster process that is kicking in, which take a lot of months for the development of new resources, right? How are you giving weightage for this generation, which is already ahead in their process? Are we giving some weightage or something so that we know that there is generation to meet the goals, right, in time? And they're not penalized because they are in certain part of the system, and without lack of transmission, they cannot be delivered, right? So how do you give the prominence or the weightage to at least the generations which are ready to go?
I would say that within the capacity expansion model, you have an initial condition, And then initial conditions, the resources that already exist on the system minus those we know are going to retire. And then you add on the known NYSERDA contracted resources where you know where they're going as well. And that's basically just the initial condition to the solution. So like we're assigning locations to ones that don't yet exist and we don't know where they're going, but the ones that we do know, we would have placed where we know they're going.
Okay. And those resources are considered like existing resources, like they're like planned and existing resources in the capacity expansion model, which need transmission. So the headroom would be utilized by them first.
Wait, I'd have to double check exactly how it's used, but yeah, I mean, like they would certainly be included within the model and accounted for properly.
Yeah, so Bill, that's where I think we need to have some clarity because this decides how the siting should be, right? And how you would make sure that those generation which are on the going into construction or have contracts don't get penalized. So that's the only point I want to make. Thank you.
It's Liz. I realize you guys are more expert in this than I am, but I'm just reacting to you using the word, where the generation is going to be. And we don't know that the generation, we're doing a modeling exercise here, which is going to make some guesses about where generation might go. But nothing about this exercise is meant to determine where generation actually will go. I want to make sure everybody understands that.
Thank you very much, Liz. I was thinking that, I think again, this goes to the siting discussion probably, where how does the queued projects, right, and contracted projects are taken into account? That's where
right.
I'm going.
And they are taken into account. We have, in essence, inclusion rules for how this model is built, and we do need to have feedback and discussion around, is the model producing reasonable guesses?
Right.
I think that is an important discussion.
Exactly, Liz. Thank you very much.
This is Nick Culpepper. I will say this doesn't address your question entirely in its entirety, but we do assume firm projects within our headroom calculations, so those are accounted for.
Thanks, Nick.
I think Mr. Berniker had a hand up.
I did, but somebody got to the point that I was getting to, so I took it down, which is that there are, quote unquote firm builds in the capacity expansion model already. But as I said, we hit on that, so nothing new on my side.
Maybe one last comment, and is that like if let's say we try, as Jeff mentioned, we try to balance on both sides, not to give developers a free access to the grid by allowing them to go wherever they want without understanding of the transmission constraints. But the other point that Radha was making and I've been making is also that there are community land resources and then community acceptance that is higher in certain areas, that makes renewable development more prone in certain regions. Southern Tier, North Country, those are known regions as rich renewable areas. And even if even if they're not assumed in this current CGBP, resources will move forward through the interconnection queue. They will be getting maybe firm, they will be included in the model as firm resources. So going into one extreme or the other could just delay expansion of the grid or just make the expansion of the grid more effective. So I think at the end of the day, it's seeing like what is the best mix of transmission and generation, and doing those sensitivities could help not going into one extreme or the other in this first CGPP. Because if renewable interest is in one area and eventually you will have to build transmission for that if renewables if you want to meet the goals, for instance. So I think it's critical that if those headroom values are met, there are some sensitivities that are being done to understand how much things are shifted by those constraints. And yeah, and then make the decision how to move forward. That was my last comment. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, that was the end of the presentation.
This is Raya Salter, Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. Just thanks, folks, for the sort of discussion that just happened. And I just want to flag again, just the need to figure out how this relates to the goals, the CLCPA's goals for disadvantaged communities, which include prioritizing investments in disadvantaged communities and matching those with other, with public policy and other resources that might come to bear there. And I just mentioned that because I think we often were thinking of, and also I won't speak for NYPA, but NYPA also has a build public renewables mandate. So just when we talk about the discussion, it isn't utility versus developer, but there's sort of a kind of a field of folks who could include cities, municipalities, community-based groups, and others that are looking to participate. So I just and we'll also be needing to be taken into account. So I just wanted to mention that and flag that.
Skylar, does that bring us sort of to the last bit?
Yeah, if there's no other questions, I think I would see if there's any other, broader questions from folks about the other scenarios or the plan for the next couple meetings. See if anybody has questions. Did I just see another hand go up? I think.
Yeah, hi, Skylar, thank you very much. One last question on this. Are the headroom values updated or they're the same from what they were from before? I just wanted to confirm.
This is Nicholas Copa from PSC Long Island. I believe we were the only ones that actually had an update from that which was filed back in August. And that update was to reflect the Long Island Offshore Wind PPTN awarded project.
Okay. Thank you very much. If we can get the updated slides, that would be great. Thanks, everyone. It's a good discussion.
And for those that are interested, the respective values by zone are broken down in an appendix to this presentation.
Is that your hand up?
Yep, thank you, Skylar. I have a general question, so I think that's what you're looking for, right? At this point.
Yep.
So just so that I understand that so two things. End of last year, there were tier 1 projects that had been terminated. Or assumptions for the state scenario or in general, the CGPP assessment? So that's the first question. And then the second part is that also related to these tier 1, whether or not these projects are part of, say, the resources committed to CPNY, the Clean Path New York. So if the contract status does impact our assumption here, would the crew feel like we also need to discuss about the modeling for CPNY? Just want to raise that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think especially with the renewable resources, this is something that came up at the very beginning of the modeling. These resources are in locations that we would expect a lot of those resources to be deployed in, and they also have their queue positions maintained in many cases, so they would be in a capacity expansion model, and we're just thinking about zones, it probably won't change the final build out that much if we say, change the inclusion rules on one of the few scenarios. But I'll turn it over to John because I think he's answered this question a whole bunch of times in different areas.
Yeah, so I think I just want to point out that we've seen contract attrition, which is not the same as project attrition. And in addition to those, mutual terminations, that have been sought for tier 1. We also have a live RFP in which we would expect to have at least a portion of those come back under contract. So, that just really reinforces Skylar's point that, by and large, those resources are in areas of high demand. Many of them are likely to still be developed despite recent events. And so as such, there's likely to, not be a large impact on what we would actually see come out of the capacity expansion model. Really, it's likely the model would choose other resources in those same areas to replace them. Add to that the fact that I think, we're well, and we all understand that, for the state scenario, we're kind of past the ability to make changes there. So we can't make any changes there, but I think there's also likely limited value in trying to make updates for the other scenarios, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's not something that can be discussed.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. I appreciate you walking through the reason.
Thanks for the question. Okay. So with that, I think I will adjourn this meeting. Keep an eye out for a email coming from the EPAC email address. We're just asking the question of whether this time slot is still good for folks, because we do plan on extending these meetings past the end of January for other purposes, and then possibly even longer. We can always cancel one if there's no results to review, but I think we still have a bunch of stuff to talk about. So we'll be scheduling those out for at least the next month or two. And so with that, I'll say thanks for joining, and thanks to JU for the presentation, and we'll talk again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Skylar.
Have a good afternoon.
So long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.